College towns aren't supposed to be dangerous. They're supposed to be coffee shops, bike lanes, and late-night study sessions. The worst thing that's supposed to happen is a bad grade, a breakup, or a flat tire. But on a bright spring morning in Corvallis, Oregon, a 19-year-old college student walked out into an apartment parking lot with a bucket and a sponge, and vanished so completely that for 5 years nobody could even say for sure if she was dead. All she left behind were 2 mangled flip-flops and a trail of broken hearts. Her name was Brooke Carol Wilberger. Brooke was born on February 20, 1985 in Fresno, California, one of 6 children in a close religious family. Her parents, Greg and Cammie, later moved the family to Oregon, where she grew up near Eugene. She was the kind of girl people remember in almost annoyingly glowing terms: kind, funny, responsible, deeply committed to her faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In high school at Elmira, just outside Eugene, she played sports, kept her grades up, helped out at church, babysat, and did all the invisible little things that make a big family run. Teachers loved her. Friends trusted her. Her younger siblings looked up to her. After graduation, she headed to Utah for her freshman year at Brigham Young University in Provo. It was a big change, but a good one. She made new friends, adjusted to college life, and kept up a long-distance relationship with her boyfriend, Justin, who was serving as a Mormon missionary in Venezuela. By May 2004, her first year at BYU was done. Like tons of college kids, she packed up, hugged her roommates goodbye, and headed home for the summer. Home, for Brooke, meant Oregon. She came back to stay with one of her older sisters, who lived in Corvallis with her husband and children. Her sister and brother-in-law managed a place called the Oak Park Apartments, just off the Oregon State University campus. A typical student complex with multiple buildings, rows of parking spaces, and tall metal light poles along the lot. Brooke wasn't just crashing on their couch, she was helping out. To earn some money and lend a hand, she took on odd jobs around the property, cleaning, small maintenance tasks, whatever needed doing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it fit her. Service-oriented, helpful, responsible. She'd barely been home 2 weeks when everything went wrong. Monday, May 24, 2004, started out ordinary. It was the kind of early summer morning where the air is still cool, but you can feel the day warming up. Corvallis, a small city in Oregon's Willamette Valley, was beginning to fill with the sounds of a college town in motion: cars, buses, students walking to class at OSU. In the Oak Park Apartments, Brooke got dressed in casual work clothes: a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops. She headed outside with a bucket, cleaning solution, and a sponge. Her task that morning was simple: wash bird droppings and grime off the metal lampposts in the parking lot. Not exactly the stuff of Dateline episodes. Her sister saw her out there working around 10 a.m. Other residents remember seeing a petite young woman cleaning the posts, blonde hair pulled back, focused on the job. A couple of people noticed her flip-flops, the bucket, the way she moved from pole to pole, and then nothing. Sometime between late morning and lunchtime, in broad daylight, in the middle of a parking lot next to occupied apartments at a major university, Brooke disappeared. No screams that neighbors remembered, no calls for help, no dramatic chase. When her sister realized she hadn't come back inside, she went looking for her. The bucket was there. The sponge was there. Her flip-flops were on the ground, bent, twisted, as if they'd been yanked off or had come off in a struggle. Brooke herself was gone. For a few minutes, it was just confusion. Maybe she'd stepped inside a neighbor's apartment. Maybe she'd gone to the office. Maybe she'd run a quick errand or taken a phone call somewhere else on the property. There are 1,000 tiny reasons a person might leave their stuff in a parking lot. But as the minutes turned into an hour and she didn't return, that confusion curdled into panic. This wasn't like her. Brooke was many things, but flaky wasn't one of them. She didn't wander off without telling anyone. She didn't just disappear without her shoes, her phone, or a single word. Her sister and brother-in-law called around, checked with neighbors, and then made a decision that would end up being critical. They called the police. When adults vanish, law enforcement often takes a wait-and-see approach. Grown-ups are allowed to walk away. Maybe it's a fight, a bad day, or a choice they'll explain later. In so many cases, officers suggest giving it a few hours. This time, Corvallis police did something different. They listened to the family. They looked at who Brooke was. A devout, responsible teenager who just finished her freshman year of college with strong ties to her family and church. And they took it seriously from the very beginning. Lieutenant Ron Noble of the Corvallis Police Department later explained that it was unusual. Normally, they would have waited to see if an adult showed up the next day. With Brooke, they agreed right away that this was out of character and treated it as an emergency. Officers responded to the apartment complex, they interviewed residents, put out bulletins, and began canvassing the area. Patrol cars drove the nearby streets. Police on foot checked alleys, bushes, dumpsters, and sheds. Very quickly, a terrifying picture started to form. A 19-year-old woman had likely been abducted in broad daylight. The flip-flops on the ground felt almost like a message. One of them, according to accounts, was damaged, as if it had been stepped on or pulled. Those little rubber shoes that every college student owns became a symbol. She hadn't walked away. She'd been taken. Within hours, the search went beyond the police. Brooke's family's Latter-day Saint congregation mobilized. Members organized search parties, printing flyers with her photo and basic details: age, height, hair color, what she'd been wearing. Volunteers combed fields, wooded areas, path edges, and side streets. Students at Oregon State joined in, walking the campus and surrounding neighborhoods. Helicopters flew over parts of town and nearby rural areas, scanning for any sign of disturbed ground, abandoned vehicles, or discarded clothing. Nothing. No ransom note, no calls. No dropped phone, no clear trail. The story traveled fast. In a state like Oregon, a missing college girl was big news. Reporters descended on Corvallis. Local newscasts led with her photo. Blonde hair, bright smile, clean BYU-style modesty. Headlines framed it as a mystery. A good girl, home from a religious university, gone without a trace. Her parents, Greg and Cammie, came in front of cameras and did the thing parents in these stories always end up having to do. They begged. They talked about her childhood, her plans, her faith. They said she'd never run away. They asked whoever had her to let her go. You could hear the hope and the horror wrestling in every word. Friends and relatives showed up in Corvallis from other parts of Oregon, Utah, and beyond. Her boyfriend, still on his mission in Venezuela, was informed through church channels and could only wait and pray half a world away. While the search was ramping up, investigators started doing the quieter work, checking sex offender registries, reviewing recent reports of stalking or suspicious vehicles, looking at other unsolved cases with similar patterns. Early on, a potential lead emerged. A young man named Sung-Koo Kim, a college student with a disturbing history of burglary and theft of women's underwear, became a person of interest in the case. He had been in the area, and his pattern of targeting young women's belongings set off alarm bells. Police raided his living space and found what you'd expect from someone with that kind of fixation: stolen lingerie, computer files, evidence of obsessions. He was eventually charged and convicted on multiple counts of burglary and theft in other counties, earning a lengthy prison sentence. But as investigators dug into his timeline, they couldn't solidly link him to Brooke's disappearance. In the end, he was never charged in her case. Whatever else he'd done, he wasn't the one who took Brooke from that parking lot. The problem was, for a long time nobody could say who did. Days turned into weeks. Corvallis felt it. A simple trip to the grocery store suddenly carried a layer of unease. Women who'd thought nothing of walking across campus at 10 a.m. now glanced over their shoulders. Parents held onto toddlers' hands a little tighter in parking lots. Posters with Brooke's photo stayed up on bulletin boards, in shop windows, on church doors. Her smile looked back from gas stations and campus kiosks. Her name was read in prayers and vigils. People left flowers near the Oak Park apartments. Her family refused to give up. They organized large-scale searches with volunteers, sometimes hundreds at a time, sweeping through forests, fields, and rural roads around Corvallis. The Benton County Emergency Management Office coordinated efforts. Search and rescue teams walked grids with dogs and GPS units. They found things, bits of trash, random clothing, old bones belonging to animals. But never Brooke. National media came calling. ABC's 2020 did a segment pairing her with another missing college student, Maura Murray, under the theme of vanished young women and their families' search for answers. America's Most Wanted featured Brooke's case multiple times, broadcasting her photo and details to millions in the hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something. Tips poured in. Most went nowhere. A girl with blonde hair spotted at a truck stop in another state. Somebody who looked like her getting into a car. Anonymous calls from people claiming psychic visions. Every lead meant hours of work. Every dead end meant another night of heartbreak. Through it all, the Wilbergers' faith became a visible part of the story. They prayed publicly. They spoke openly about relying on God. At a gathering at Oregon State University's campus, her mother Cammie thanked the community for their support and talked about holding on to hope even when there was no news. They kept her room as it had been. They talked about Brooke in the present tense. But as the first anniversary of her disappearance neared in May 2005, harsh reality set in. There had been no credible sightings, no contact, no ransom, no evidence that she was out there living some secret new life. Behind the hopeful statements, her parents quietly acknowledged what everybody else knew but didn't want to say. The chances that Brooke was alive were vanishingly small. The case file grew thicker. Detectives tracked down and ruled out other potential suspects. The FBI offered assistance. At one point, they even looked at whether other disappearances in different states might be connected. The work of a serial predator moving from place to place. But with no body and no obvious suspect, everything stalled. For more than 6 months after that morning in May, the most publicized missing persons case in Oregon dragged on with no break. Corvallis went back to work and class and grocery runs, but the undercurrent never went away. The parking lot at Oak Park Apartments kept filling and emptying with cars. New tenants moved in, old ones moved out. But if you walked past those lampposts and looked down at the pavement, it wasn't hard to imagine the outline of 2 flip-flops and a bucket of soapy water. That image stayed in investigators' minds too. They had a victim. They had a scene. They had a rough window of time. What they didn't have was a face, a name, or a vehicle to attach to the phantom who had pulled up, grabbed a crying young woman in broad daylight, and vanished. Then, in early December 2004, more than 6 months after Brooke disappeared, something happened nearly 300 miles away in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A foreign exchange student was walking to her car. A man in a green van pulled up. He attacked her, beat her, raped her, and tried to shove her inside. She fought back. She escaped. She survived. And she remembered what he looked like. Within days, her attacker was in handcuffs. His name was Joel Patrick Courtney. At first, he was just another violent offender going through the New Mexico courts. But when detectives in Oregon saw the details, the van, the stranger attack, the way he operated, Something clicked. For the first time since May 24, 2004, the investigation into Brooke's disappearance had a new name. In the next part, we'll follow that name. Who Joel Courtney really was, how a horrific assault in New Mexico led Corvallis detectives to him, and the bone-chilling evidence they eventually found inside his green van that changed Brooke's case from missing to murder. Long before anyone knew where her body was. When Joel Patrick Courtney sat in a New Mexico jail cell in December 2004, he probably thought his biggest problem was the case right in front of him. He had no idea that investigators in another state, 300 miles away, were about to look at his name and think, what if this is our guy? To understand how that happened, we have to rewind a little and look at who Joel Courtney actually was. On paper, he didn't look like some master criminal. Born in 1966, he was a native of Portland, Oregon. People who knew him over the years described him as a drifter and a drinker. A guy who bounced from place to place, working odd jobs, never really settling. He used drugs. He had a temper. He married and had 3 children. But stable family man doesn't seem to have been his default mode. By early 2004, he was back in Oregon, staying around Portland and the Willamette Valley. In January 2004, he was arrested in Oregon on a drunk driving charge. He was supposed to show up in court on May 24, 2004. That date should sound familiar. It's the exact day Brooke vanished from the Oak Park Apartments in Corvallis. He never showed up for that court date. On May 24th, while a judge was waiting for him in a courtroom, he was somewhere else. Later, prosecutors would argue that somewhere else was Corvallis, specifically a parking lot where a 19-year-old college student was scrubbing bird droppings off lampposts. But in 2004, nobody knew that yet. For months after Brooke disappeared, investigators in Oregon had only a few solid pieces. A victim with no history of running away, a scene in broad daylight, a pair of abandoned flip-flops, and scattered reports of a strange green van. The van reports started trickling in almost immediately after word spread that a BYU student had been abducted near the Oregon State campus. One OSU Athletics Department employee said he'd seen a green van with out-of-state plates, Minnesota plates, parked near Resser Stadium that morning. He remembered the driver talking with a female student in the lot. She later told a coworker that a man in a van had approached her, asked questions, made her uneasy. She walked away and got to safety. Another woman reported that a man in a green van had pulled in front of her, asked for directions, then got out and opened the rear door of the van as if inviting her closer. Her instincts screamed at her. She backed off, ended the encounter, and left. Taken separately, those could have been nothing, just weird moments in a college town full of strangers. Taken together and laid alongside the fact that a young woman then disappeared from an apartment complex a short walk away, they felt like pieces of the same sick puzzle. Witnesses described the vehicle as a green minivan. They couldn't give a license plate number with certainty, but the details were enough for investigators to start combing through records looking for green vans in the area, especially ones with out-of-state registration. Nothing clicked immediately. The case went cold in public, but behind the scenes, detectives kept grinding through lists of registered vehicles and known predators. They checked local sex offenders. They looked at men who'd been reported for stalking or harassment. They came up empty. Then, in November 2004, the phone rang. This time, it was New Mexico. On November 30, 2004, in Albuquerque, a 22-year-old foreign exchange student at the University of New Mexico was walking near campus when a man in a vehicle pulled up next to her. He had a knife. The attack that followed was brutal. He forced her into his car at knife point, tied her hands using her own shoelaces, and drove her to a secluded area. Reports mention a parking lot, where he beat her and sexually assaulted her. She was terrified, alone, convinced she might die in a country that wasn't even hers. But at some point, she got an opening. When he was distracted, she fought. She managed to get out of the vehicle, partially clothed, and run for help. She found people, told them what had happened, and described her attacker and his car. Within hours, police had a name: Joel Patrick Courtney. When they picked him up, he had a knife and a crack pipe on him. He was charged with kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and aggravated battery. A judge ordered him held in jail pending trial. At first, to Albuquerque detectives, he was one more dangerous predator in a state already dealing with way too many of them. But the FBI looks at patterns: young woman, college campus, random stranger attack, forced into a vehicle at knife point. The crime in New Mexico looked disturbingly like the Brooke case in Oregon, and that's where the line started to cross. Federal agents dug into Courtney's background. They saw that he was from Oregon. They saw the outstanding warrant from that missed DUI court date. They saw that the missed appearance fell on May 24, 2004. They called Oregon. Soon, Oregon investigators were sending and receiving faxes, files, and phone calls. They traded details about the green van. They learned that Courtney had been driving a green Dodge Caravan in 2004, a company van he used while working for a janitorial service with Minnesota plates. Minnesota plates, green van. Exactly what that OSU employee had remembered in the Reser Stadium parking lot. The more they looked, the worse it got. Courtney's travel history showed that he had been in Oregon around the time Brooke disappeared. He'd bounced around the Willamette Valley. He was supposedly headed from Portland to Newport on the coast on May 24th, but never showed up for the work or contacts he was supposed to meet there. For investigators who'd been stuck staring at a blank space where their suspect's face should be, this was the first time a name snapped into focus. Joel Courtney wasn't just a random creep in New Mexico. He might be their creep. They didn't rush out and announce it. They started quietly. Detectives from Oregon flew to New Mexico to interview him in jail, feel him out, see what kind of person they were dealing with. He denied any involvement in Brooke's disappearance. He had explanations, excuses, ways to muddy his timeline. But the more they tugged on the threads of his life in 2004, the more they found. They tracked down his employment records. In Portland and elsewhere, he'd worked a string of low-level jobs that let him move around at odd hours. Janitorial work, cleaning crews. Things that put him on the road, sometimes alone, sometimes late at night or early in the morning. They talked to people who had seen the green van in Corvallis that day and showed them photo lineups. An OSU employee picked him out. A student who'd had a creepy encounter with the van picked him out too. He had been there. The van itself had its own story to tell. After Courtney left Oregon in mid-2004 and drifted toward New Mexico, he kept using that green Dodge Caravan. It wasn't his property. It belonged to the janitorial company. When he stopped showing up for work, the company took the van back. By the time Oregon and federal investigators came knocking, the vehicle was sitting in New Mexico, no longer in his possession, but not destroyed either. They got a search warrant. Inside the van, FBI forensic specialists found what you might expect in a vehicle used by a violent offender: stains, fibers, hair. They collected samples, sent them to labs, waited for results. What came back wasn't vague. They found blonde hairs consistent with Brooke's hair color in the van. They found a hair tie in Courtney's personal duffel bag with blonde hairs tangled in it. They found DNA traces that matched Brooke. Think about that. A girl disappears from a Corvallis parking lot, leaving only flip-flops behind. Months later, investigators test a van driven by a man from Portland, now in jail in New Mexico for a knife-point campus kidnapping. They find her DNA in his vehicle. It was the kind of hard physical link detectives had been praying for since May 24th. If a jury convicted him as charged, he could be sent to death row. And the state had a lot more than suspicion now. They had witnesses who'd seen a green van with Minnesota plates around the Oregon State campus on the morning Brooke disappeared. They had women who described creepy encounters with that same van and its driver. They had the forensic evidence, Brooke's DNA in the van, blonde hairs in a hair tie inside his duffel bag, fibers and trace materials that put her in his vehicle. They had travel records and work schedules that placed him in Oregon at exactly the right time, and nowhere he could verify being when she vanished. They had the New Mexico case, another young woman, another college campus, another random attack, showing a pattern of behavior that would be very hard for a jury to ignore. The one thing they still didn't have was Brooke herself. Her body was still out there somewhere. That missing piece mattered for a lot of reasons. For the Wilbergers, it was the difference between a wound and a grave. They couldn't bury their daughter, couldn't see where she was, couldn't put flowers on anything but a photo and an empty patch of air. For prosecutors, it was a tactical problem. Could they win a death penalty case without a body? Yes, it was legally possible. They'd already gone as far as indicting him that way. But walking no body evidence into a capital trial is a huge risk. All it takes is one juror thinking, what if? And the penalty phase changes. Courtney knew that too. From his cell in Oregon, he played the game that a lot of killers play once they're caught. He shut his mouth. Whatever he said in New Mexico or in private conversations with investigators, he hadn't given up the one thing only he knew, where Brooke was and what exactly he'd done. As the scheduled trial date in early 2010 crept closer, pre-trial motions stacked up. Defense attorneys filed paperwork challenging the validity of certain evidence, arguing about what should and shouldn't be allowed in front of a jury. Prosecutors filed their responses, insisting that jurors deserved to hear about the attempted abductions of other women in Corvallis that morning and about his New Mexico conviction. The death penalty hovered over every conversation. For the public, death or life often looks like a simple moral question. For the family in the middle of the storm, it's something else entirely. At some point, Haraldson sat down with Greg and Cammie Wilberger and laid out the reality. If they kept going toward a capital trial, it would be long, agonizing, and uncertain. They might win a death sentence. They might not. Even if they did, appeals could drag on for decades. Meanwhile, the one person who knew where Brooke's body was could hold on to that information forever. Or they could make a deal. Not a soft one. Not anything that meant someday he walks free. A deal that guaranteed he would die in prison in exchange for the one thing they wanted almost as much as a conviction: to bring Brooke home. Most of us would love to think we know exactly what we'd say in that moment, that we'd stand firm, demand the maximum, refuse to trade. The truth is messier. By 2009, the Wilbergers had been living in limbo for 5 years, 5 Christmases, 5 birthdays, 5 anniversaries of that May morning. They had sat through hearing after hearing. They had looked at Courtney's face more times than any parent ever should have to look at the man accused of killing their child. They were exhausted. In interviews later, Cammie would say something that surprises people at first, that she felt gratitude toward Joel Courtney, not for what he did, never that, but for finally, at the very end, telling the truth and letting them find Brooke. That gratitude wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the sudden, overwhelming relief of not having to wonder anymore where her daughter was. As the trial date loomed, plea negotiations became serious. The prosecution's offer was clear. Courtney would plead guilty to aggravated murder. He would waive his right to appeal. He would receive a true life sentence, life without the possibility of parole. He would serve that sentence in New Mexico, not Oregon, stacked on top of his existing term there. And most importantly, he would give a full, detailed account of what he did to Brooke and lead investigators to her remains. If he held back, lied, or failed to provide her location, the deal was off, and the state would go forward with seeking death. For a man who had taken pride in his ability to vanish into remote places, this was the one piece of leverage he had left. He knew exactly how carefully he'd hidden her. He knew that search teams had walked those hills before and missed her. He knew that without his directions, odds were high she'd never be found. In September 2009, 5 years and 4 months after Brooke disappeared, Joel Courtney finally blinked. On a Saturday, he was brought from his cell, sat down with investigators and lawyers, and told them what they'd been waiting to hear. Piece by piece, he unfolded the story that had been locked inside his head since May 24, 2004. He admitted that he had gone hunting that morning, hunting for a victim. Before he ever saw Brooke, he tried to grab 2 other young women near the Oregon State campus. One was an OSU student walking near Reser Stadium. He pulled his green van up, tried to engage, opened the side door. She felt the danger and walked away fast. Another encounter ended the same way. The women's instincts screamed at them, and they escaped. Then he drove toward the Oak Park apartments. He saw Brooke alone in the parking lot, cleaning light fixtures. Her bucket and sponge were on the ground. She was working near the end of a parking lane with a building on one side and parked cars forming a kind of funnel. He pulled his van in to block the exit. According to prosecutors' later summary, he grabbed an envelope and pretended to be a delivery man. When she looked up, he waved the envelope to get her attention. As she stepped closer, he pulled a knife. Whatever smooth line he had rehearsed in his head, Brooke didn't respond like a passive victim. She fought. He forced her into the van at knife point and bound her with duct tape, her hands, probably her mouth. He shoved her onto the floor or a seat, closed the doors, and drove out of the lot. Behind him, in the parking space, 2 flip-flops lay abandoned. Courtney told investigators he drove west, out of Corvallis, onto Highway 20, toward the Oregon Coast Range. He took a side road somewhere between the small communities of Blodgett and Wren, into timber country. A maze of gravel spurs, logging roads, and dense woods that only locals and loggers really know. He stopped in a secluded area off one of those roads and kept her there, bound, inside the van. Later, he claimed he went back into town to buy food while she was still tied up in the vehicle, a detail that disturbed even seasoned detectives. If a jury convicted him as charged, he could be sent to death row. And the state had a lot more than suspicion now. They had witnesses who'd seen a green van with Minnesota plates around the Oregon State campus on the morning Brooke disappeared. They had women who described creepy encounters with that same van and its driver. They had the forensic evidence, Brooke's DNA in the van, blonde hairs in a hair tie inside his duffel bag, fibers and trace materials that put her in his vehicle. They had travel records and work schedules that placed him in Oregon at exactly the right time, and nowhere he could verify being when she vanished. They had the New Mexico case, another young woman, another college campus, another random attack, showing a pattern of behavior that would be very hard for a jury to ignore. The one thing they still didn't have was Brooke herself. Her body was still out there somewhere. That missing piece mattered for a lot of reasons. For the Wilbergers, it was the difference between a wound and a grave. They couldn't bury their daughter, couldn't see where she was, couldn't put flowers on anything but a photo and an empty patch of air. For prosecutors, it was a tactical problem. Could they win a death penalty case without a body? Yes, it was legally possible. They'd already gone as far as indicting him that way. But walking no body evidence into a capital trial is a huge risk. All it takes is one juror thinking, "What if?" And the penalty phase changes. Courtney knew that too. From his cell in Oregon, he played the game that a lot of killers play once they're caught. He shut his mouth. Whatever he said in New Mexico or in private conversations with investigators, he hadn't given up the one thing only he knew: where Brooke was and what exactly he'd done. As the scheduled trial date in early 2010 crept closer, pre-trial motions stacked up. Defense attorneys filed paperwork challenging the validity of certain evidence, arguing about what should and shouldn't be allowed in front of a jury. Prosecutors filed their responses, insisting that jurors deserved to hear about the attempted abductions of other women in Corvallis that morning and about his New Mexico conviction. The death penalty hovered over every conversation. For the public, death or life often looks like a simple moral question. For the family in the middle of the storm, it's something else entirely. At some point, Haraldson sat down with Greg and Cammie Wilberger and laid out the reality. If they kept going toward a capital trial, it would be long, agonizing, and uncertain. They might win a death sentence. They might not. Even if they did, appeals could drag on for decades. Meanwhile, the one person who knew where Brooke's body was could hold on to that information forever. Or they could make a deal. Not a soft one. Not anything that meant someday he walks free. A deal that guaranteed he would die in prison in exchange for the one thing they wanted almost as much as a conviction: to bring Brooke home. Most of us would love to think we know exactly what we'd say in that moment, that we'd stand firm, demand the maximum, refuse to trade. The truth is messier. By 2009, the Wilbergers had been living in limbo for 5 years, 5 Christmases, 5 birthdays, 5 anniversaries of that May morning. They had sat through hearing after hearing. They had looked at Courtney's face more times than any parent ever should have to look at the man accused of killing their child. They were exhausted. In interviews later, Cammie would say something that surprises people at first, that she felt gratitude toward Joel Courtney, not for what he did, never that, but for finally, at the very end, telling the truth and letting them find Brooke. That gratitude wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the sudden, overwhelming relief of not having to wonder anymore where her daughter was. As the trial date loomed, plea negotiations became serious. The prosecution's offer was clear. Courtney would plead guilty to aggravated murder. He would waive his right to appeal. He would receive a true life sentence, life without the possibility of parole. He would serve that sentence in New Mexico, not Oregon, stacked on top of his existing term there. And most importantly, he would give a full, detailed account of what he did to Brooke and lead investigators to her remains. If he held back, lied, or failed to provide her location, the deal was off, and the state would go forward with seeking death. For a man who had taken pride in his ability to vanish into remote places, this was the one piece of leverage he had left. He knew exactly how carefully he'd hidden her. He knew that search teams had walked those hills before and missed her. He knew that without his directions, odds were high she'd never be found. In September 2009, 5 years and 4 months after Brooke disappeared, Joel Courtney finally blinked. On a Saturday, he was brought from his cell, sat down with investigators and lawyers, and told them what they'd been waiting to hear. Piece by piece, he unfolded the story that had been locked inside his head since May 24, 2004. He admitted that he had gone hunting that morning, hunting for a victim. Before he ever saw Brooke, he tried to grab 2 other young women near the Oregon State campus. One was an OSU student walking near Reser Stadium. He pulled his green van up, tried to engage, opened the side door. She felt the danger and walked away fast. Another encounter ended the same way. The women's instincts screamed at them, and they escaped. Then he drove toward the Oak Park apartments. He saw Brooke alone in the parking lot, cleaning light fixtures. Her bucket and sponge were on the ground. She was working near the end of a parking lane with a building on one side and parked cars forming a kind of funnel. He pulled his van in to block the exit. According to prosecutors' later summary, he grabbed an envelope and pretended to be a delivery man. When she looked up, he waved the envelope to get her attention. As she stepped closer, he pulled a knife. Whatever smooth line he had rehearsed in his head, Brooke didn't respond like a passive victim. She fought. He forced her into the van at knife point and bound her with duct tape, her hands, probably her mouth. He shoved her onto the floor or a seat, closed the doors, and drove out of the lot. Behind him, in the parking space, 2 flip-flops lay abandoned. Courtney told investigators he drove west, out of Corvallis, onto Highway 20, toward the Oregon Coast Range. He took a side road somewhere between the small communities of Blodgett and Wren, into timber country. A maze of gravel spurs, logging roads, and dense woods that only locals and loggers really know. He stopped in a secluded area off one of those roads and kept her there, bound, inside the van. Later, he claimed he went back into town to buy food while she was still tied up in the vehicle, a detail that disturbed even seasoned detectives. It showed how casually he treated her terror, like she was just an object he could leave, come back to, and use whenever he felt like it. He said he kept her alive through the night. On May 25th, the next morning, he raped her. Brooke didn't quietly submit. She fought him. She struggled so hard, according to his own words, that he decided he had to kill her. The district attorney later said, his comment was that he was surprised that she fought so hard. Imagine that for a moment. A 19-year-old girl, far from anyone who could help her, bound, threatened with a knife, held in a stranger's van in the middle of the woods. And she still fought enough to shock him. Courtney told them that he bludgeoned her to death when she resisted the assault. Reports describe him using a blunt object, hitting her in the head until she stopped moving. No mercy, no pause, just raw, brutal force. Afterward, he wasn't done being methodical. He moved her body. He carried or dragged her a short distance off the road, up a slope, and found a fallen tree. Beneath that log, he dug a shallow space and placed her body there. Then he covered her with dirt, ferns, and moss. He took pride later in describing how well he'd hidden her, how remote the location was, how unlikely it was that anyone would ever stumble across the spot. His intent was that no one ever find her, the district attorney said afterward. Back in 2004, volunteers had indeed walked some of those very roads in their searches. They'd passed within hundreds of yards of her, maybe less, but the forest kept it secret. Only he knew exactly where she was. Now, as part of the plea deal, he had to give that knowledge up. On the same weekend he confessed, Courtney led investigators to the site. He didn't physically walk free with them through the woods. Security and logistics made that complicated. But he gave extremely detailed directions. Which mile marker off Highway 20, which turnoff, how far up the abandoned logging road, what landmarks to look for, how the land sloped, where the fallen tree lay. Search teams drove out onto Highway 20, the road that runs west from Corvallis toward the coast, and turned off near Blodgett onto a narrow, overgrown spur. They parked and walked. About 500 yards up the old logging road, in thick forest on private timberland, they found the fallen tree he'd described. Beneath it, exactly where he said she would be, they began to uncover human remains. Carefully, slowly, over multiple days. Forensic teams and search and rescue crews worked at the site. The body had been there for more than 5 years. Time, animals, and weather had done their work, but enough remained. Bones, fragments, traces of clothing, for the medical examiner and forensic specialists to confirm what everybody felt in their bones the moment the first piece was uncovered. It was Brooke. Word didn't go public immediately. Authorities kept the exact location secret at first, to protect the scene and make sure they'd recovered everything. They notified the family before facing cameras. In that private moment, someone finally spoke the sentence Greg and Cammie had been both dreading and needing for 5 years. We found her. On September 21st, 2009, the world found out too. At a press conference, District Attorney John Haroldson announced that Joel Courtney had pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, that he would serve life without parole, and that he had led authorities to Brooke's remains. Standing beside him, Cammie Wilberger spoke with a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and a strange, fragile relief. She talked about gratitude. Not for the 5 years of pain, but for finally having her daughter back in a way that allowed them to say goodbye. After 5 years of missing, Brooke was no longer a question mark. She was a young woman who had been kidnapped, raped, murdered, and hidden in the Oregon Coast Range by a predator who had hunted her like prey. There was no more maybe. There was only what had happened and what would happen next. In the final part, we'll look at the sentencing and aftermath, how the plea deal reshaped the idea of justice for Brooke's family, what Courtney's true life sentence really means, how her community and BYU friends reacted when her body was finally found, and the uncomfortable truth her case leaves behind about safety, randomness, and the predators who move through our everyday lives without us ever knowing. The courtroom was packed when Joel Courtney finally said the word everyone had been waiting to hear. Guilty, 5 letters that couldn't begin to cover 5.5 years of fear, searching, and unanswered questions. But for the Wilberger family, it was the first time the man who stole their daughter's life actually owned what he'd done. On September 21st, 2009, Joel Patrick Courtney stood before an Oregon judge and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder for the abduction, rape, and killing of 19-year-old Brooke Carol Wilberger. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Instead, he received the harshest sentence Oregon could give short of death: life in prison. Without the possibility of parole, no appeals, no second chances, no maybe someday. Under the terms of the plea, he would finish serving his 18-year sentence in New Mexico for the kidnapping and rape of the foreign exchange student there, and then be transferred to Oregon custody to live out the rest of his life behind bars. No matter what happened in New Mexico, Oregon's sentence was waiting for him like a brick wall at the end of a dark hallway. In that courtroom, the legal story of Brooke's murder effectively ended. But for her family, the plea was about something far bigger than where Joel Courtney would die. It was about where Brooke would rest. Part of the deal, the part that actually mattered to the Wilbergers, was that Courtney had to tell the truth, in detail, about what he'd done. He had to explain how he'd taken her, what he'd done to her, and most importantly, where he'd hidden her body. He'd kept that secret for more than 5 years. He'd watched news reports, heard about searches, seen the photos of volunteers trekking through the Coast Range, and said nothing. Now, with the threat of a death sentence hanging over him, he finally talked. Once investigators confirmed his story and found Brooke's remains along that abandoned logging road off Highway 20, the plea was locked in. In open court, the judge reviewed the facts, confirmed that Courtney understood he was giving up any right to appeal or ever ask for release, and accepted the agreement. Then it was time for the people who loved Brooke to speak. Victim impact statements are brutal in any case. In a case like this, they're almost unbearable. Brooke's parents, Greg and Cammie, had already lived every parent's horror in slow motion. They'd done the press conferences, the searches, the birthdays with an empty chair. Now they were being asked to sum it all up in a few pages of prepared remarks. They talked about who Brooke had been. A 5th child in a big family, a girl who happily watched younger siblings, who teased and laughed and sang along to songs in the car. They talked about her faith, about her decision to attend BYU, about the excitement of her first year in Utah and the joy of having her back in Oregon for the summer. They described the moment they got the phone call that she was missing, the endless days that followed, the holidays where they set a place for her in their hearts, but not at the table. The way their other children's lives had been pulled into orbit around her absence. They thanked the community, the hundreds of volunteers who had combed through fields and forests, the students who'd put up posters and joined search parties, the people who'd prayed for a girl they'd never met. And then, in a moment that stunned a lot of people watching, Cammie said something almost no one expected. She said they felt gratitude, not for what had been done to their daughter, that could never be forgiven or softened, but gratitude that, at the very end, Joel Courtney had finally told them where she was. After 5.5 years of waking up every day not knowing where their child's body lay, they finally had an answer. They could bring her home. They could give her a proper burial. They could stand at a real grave instead of staring at a map full of question marks. To people outside that grief, gratitude toward a killer can sound impossible. To a mother who's been living in limbo for half a decade, it can feel like air after drowning. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around microphones. The district attorney explained the terms of the deal. He didn't sugarcoat who Joel Courtney was or what he'd done. He made it clear that they'd originally intended to seek the death penalty, and that the only reason they didn't was because the family believed finding Brooke was more important than watching her killer sit on death row for the next 30 years. It's one of those impossible choices that only exists in theory for most of us. For them, it was real. Do you push for execution and risk never finding your daughter, or trade that possibility for the certainty of knowing where she is? The Wilbergers chose certainty. Shortly after the plea, authorities finished recovering Brooke's remains from beneath the fallen tree where Courtney had hidden her. Technicians and searchers worked carefully, documenting every piece, sifting soil, collecting bone fragments, and anything else the forest had preserved. When the work was done, the site was just another patch of mossy ground on private timberland, anonymous again to anyone passing by. But the remains were now in the custody of people who loved her. Her family finally got to do something they'd been denied for 5 years: plan a funeral. Out of respect for their privacy, a lot of the details of her burial were kept quiet. What we do know is that services were held in Oregon, and that they were deeply rooted in the family's Latter-day Saint faith. Hymns, prayers, and words about eternal families mixed with tears and the raw ache of parents burying a child. Friends from Elmira High School, from their church congregation, and from BYU came to pay their respects. Some remembered the last time they'd seen her, heading off to college, excited and nervous. Others had only known her as the missing girl. And now, finally, as someone they could mourn properly. At BYU, the news hit hard. For 5 years, students there had followed Brooke's case. Many remembered the missing posters, the campus prayers, the coverage in church-owned newspapers. When word came that her body had been found and that her killer would die in prison, the reactions were mixed: sorrow, relief, anger, and a strange sense of closure. Classmates who'd lived with her in dorms or attended freshman classes with her shared memories, her kindness, her sense of humor, the way she talked about her family. One friend said that even in the worst of the uncertainty, she'd always believed Brooke was in God's hands. Now, at least, she knew where her body was too. In Corvallis, the community that had lived under the shadow of her disappearance for so long also exhaled. For years, the name Brooke had been part of the town's vocabulary, spoken at council meetings, in church pews, at OSU events. Search maps and volunteer sign-up lists had become part of the local landscape. Parents had used her story to warn their kids about walking alone. With Courtney's confession and sentencing, Corvallis could finally say that the man who'd invaded their college town bubble was gone for good. There was no serial kidnapper roaming the streets anymore. No unknown predator driving a green van past campus. Just one man locked away in another state, with 2 life sentences stacked on his back. For law enforcement, the plea was a confirmation that their instincts had been right. The work they had done, patiently connecting the green van in Corvallis to the attack in New Mexico, tracking Courtney's movements, testing the DNA in the van, pushing for extradition, had led to the right person. For the FBI, it closed at least one branch of a larger, more frightening question: whether Joel Courtney had killed other women in other towns. They'd looked at him for multiple unsolved cases. Over time, they ruled him out in some, and no additional charges materialized. In the end, Brooke's murder and the New Mexico attack remain his known crimes, though nobody doubts he might have attempted other assaults that never made it into the system. The question of the death penalty, though, didn't simply disappear once the plea deal was signed. Some people believed he deserved to die for what he did, full stop. Others said the outcome, a life sentence without parole, plus his New Mexico term, was exactly right. He would spend every remaining day of his life in prison, never touching free soil again. And the family had Brooke back. Even the district attorney later admitted that the choice wasn't easy. As a prosecutor, he had sought capital punishment. As a human being, he sat across from grieving parents and heard what they needed most. In the end, he said, this case forced him to confront what justice really meant. Not in theory, but for this family, in this place, at this time. For Greg and Cammie, the trial that never happened meant their daughter's last moments wouldn't be dissected in a public courtroom for weeks on end. They didn't have to sit through a defense attempting to poke holes in the evidence or minimize what had been done. They didn't have to endure autopsy photos blown up for jurors or cross-examination of their other children or friends. Instead, they got something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. The truth, in enough detail to answer their questions. A sentence that guarantees he never gets out, and the chance to bury their daughter with dignity. In the years since, Brooke's name has continued to live on, not just as a victim, but as a person. Her family has spoken publicly about how their faith carried them, both in the searching years and after her body was found. They've addressed communities and congregations about hope, about forgiveness, and about trusting God, even in the worst imaginable circumstances. Students at Oregon State and BYU still hear her story in conversations about campus safety. When parents drop off their kids at college, some of them remember that bright-faced freshman from Oregon who vanished cleaning lampposts in a parking lot. Teachers and parents use her case to talk about listening to your instincts, the way those other young women around OSU did that morning, walking away from the green van when something felt wrong. Don't talk yourself out of that feeling, the lesson goes. You're not being rude, you're staying alive. There's another lesson buried in there too, one that's harder to say out loud. You can do everything right, be responsible, be kind, stay in public places in daylight, and still cross paths with someone who has decided that your life is his to take. Brooke didn't go to a party with strangers or wander into a dangerous neighborhood. She went outside on a Monday morning to wash bird droppings off a metal pole. The danger didn't come from some dark alley. It rolled up in a green van driven by a man who'd decided that day he was going hunting. And yet, even in the face of that, the one thing everyone who's heard Courtney's confession agrees on is this: she fought. She fought so hard that he commented on it later, almost surprised by her resistance. She refused, in those final moments, to just be a passive victim. It didn't save her life, but it speaks volumes about who she was. A small, 19-year-old girl in a van in the woods with a knife-wielding predator. And she still made him work to kill her. That's not the memory her family clings to. They remember laughter, faith, kindness. But for the rest of us, it says something about the human will to survive, even when the odds are impossible. Today, Joel Courtney wakes up every morning in a cell, serving a sentence that will only end when his life does. No green vans, no college campuses, no hunting. He will never walk the streets of Corvallis again. He will never see the Oregon Coast Range as anything but a memory and a set of directions he once gave up to save his own skin. Brooke, meanwhile, rests where her family can visit her, not under a log in the forest hidden by moss and ferns, but in a place chosen with love. So now I want to ask you, do you think the plea deal was the right choice? Is it better to trade the death penalty for the truth and a body? Or should prosecutors have pushed all the way to a capital trial, even if it meant the possibility of never finding her? And what stays with you most about this case? The randomness of the crime, the power of forensic evidence, the strength of Brooke's family, or the fact that in a quiet college town in the middle of an ordinary day, a predator was able to turn a parking lot into a crime scene in seconds? Tell me in the comments. If you want more long-form, victim-centered true crime stories like this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next case. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and remember Brooke, not just for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived right up until the very end.